I'm going to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. And the title of what I'm going to be presenting is called Mimesis of the New Man, the 1930s from Ideology to Anthropolitics. And that's a kind of unfamiliar term of anthropolitics. I'll be explaining a little bit more about what I'm speaking of. But we think about ideology as one of the ways in which to think about the spectrum and the nature of politics. And I'm suggesting in the 1930s that there's the emergence of a politics that really is about the consideration of the nature of human being. And that this emerges from, but it doesn't necessarily map very neatly onto the ideological spectrum of right to left, which we think of as really the kind of polarities that emerge very strongly in the ideological politics of the 1930s, most importantly the struggles between fascism and communism, but that kind of ideological polarization. So from that, I'll just say that I'm going to be discussing the interconnection of two paradigms in which this politics of culture were cast by European intellectuals, both of the political right and of the left during the 1930s. The contemporary moment for these intellectuals was often characterized, and I think it's the way that it's really characterized in the scholarly literature today, historical literature. It's characterized as a time of escalating ideological conflict and a sharpening of ideological polarities, even to the point of a state of emergency and a moment of decision. So a conflict of communism and fascism, of democratic and anti-democratic forces, of pluralistic and totalitarian societies, and other such polarized ideological constructions. At the same time, and also by some of the very same thinkers that were really contributing to this polarized ideological discourse, we also have another conceptual framework to bear on the questions of the present in the 1930s. And this is the framework that I'm characterizing as an anthropolitical one. One that responds to perceived changes in or emergent possibilities, potentialities of human being itself under the pressures of collective politics, technology, science, or the intentional utopian cultural political projects, both of the avant-garde and also of extra aesthetic forces and communities. So the main point really that I want to kind of emphasize at the very beginning is these are not opposed paradigms of ideological and anthropolitical. Rather, there's a kind of complementarity and complicated dialectic between them in which the situation of ideological crisis raises the possibility of a reimagination of this politics of the human, this anthropological politics. And we get this variety of different visions of the possibility of the emergence of certain kinds of new human capacities or some sort of fundamental mutation in human nature. So I'll start with, I don't have an exciting visual PowerPoint, but I did put some of the longer and more difficult quotations up here that will allow you to read those as well as hear them. And the first quotation is from the philosophers, the Frankfurt School philosophers Axel Honneth and Hans Joos, in their book Social Action and Human Nature. They write that philosophical anthropology during the interwar years met with great public interest and assumed an almost fashionable character, which was to be surpassed only by existential philosophy. They write, "It is only too clear how strongly all these concerns were linked to the attempts of intellectuals to achieve clarity about the premises and principles of their thought, to gain a firm standpoint in the midst of the crisis-shaken Weimar Republic." Now one can see, I think, analogous anthropological concerns expressed in a broad spectrum of late modernist literary and cultural writing of the 1930s. So thus, for instance, the painter and writer Wyndham Lewis offered in his 1934 work of cultural criticism entitled Men Without Art, and he really saw the 1930s as this period in which the question of art and the question of its relationship to humanity was really being questioned. He wrote that that Men Without Art was really a question of the interpretation of the great cluster of movements disrupting our time. Lewis, if you're not familiar with his work, he was one of the so-called men of 1914, Joyce, Eliot, Pound, and Lewis, and he was probably the most important British literary intellectual who was close to fascism, or in some ways a kind of a fellow traveler, at least for some time. So a real figure of cultural authority on the one hand, and a figure of very definitely of the political right on the other hand. And what he writes in Men Without Art, this is one of his paintings as well, he wrote, "It is not any personality, nature, or even particular ruling class that is aimed at, but an entire human revolution. It is as though a mind had placed itself over against the world and formed the resolve to reconstitute the human idea itself. It is the whole of humanity this time that is at stake. The philosopher's dissatisfaction with the human animal expresses itself at the heart of this disturbance, rather even than the outraged prophet's disgust at the way men treat each other." So if you heard Charlie Altieri's talk yesterday, Lewis is basically saying it's not a moral question any longer, it's an anthropological question. For Lewis, the collective political disturbances of the 1930s were not simply ethical or moral issues, they were anthropological, striving to transcend the limitations of humanity, or at least humanity's given physical and intellectual powers. Yet this situation of dissatisfaction with the human animal was for some not a matter of dismay. And I would say Lewis is ambiguous about that. There's certain kinds of possibilities that he celebrates, while there's a fairly strongly negative tone. For many, it offered a utopian prospect for development and practical realization, a new political prospect for the anthropos to transcend the putatively natural history of humankind. Now, from the opposite side of the political spectrum, as Wyndham Lewis, in a little-known essay that was buried in the exile publication Internationale Literatur, and for fairly obvious reasons later not reprinted, the Hungarian Marxist critic Georg Lukács, who was then in Moscow, greeted the draft of the 1936 Stalin Constitution of the USSR as nothing less than an epochal moment in the development of human personality, because of the USSR's establishment in communalized property, a materially equal basis for the unfolding of naturally rooted capacities and abilities. And I'm speaking in Lukács's voice here, not as an objective historical description of what Stalin's Russia was all about. Lukács, whose Marxist Aristotelian conception of literature as the mimetic rendering of typical human activity, addressed his marks on the Stalin Constitution to writers. He suggests implicitly that they have, at this moment in history, 1936, a unique opportunity for literary creation because of the emergence of a new sort of human personality in Stalin's new socialist constitutional order. Lukács calls upon the writers to affirm the imminent new order of personality the 1936 Constitution will inaugurate, and in turn, they will have the privileges of being the epic bards of a new humanity in a new historical dawn. So while this essay probably very much served as a kind of embarrassment to the later Lukács, who was an anti-Stalinist after 1956 and was in lots of ways kind of revisionist about his 1930s history, its philosophical assumptions are actually consonant with other much more respectable and canonized essays of Lukács from the 1930s. In an important essay on intellectual physiognomy and characterization, really one of his main 1930s essays, Lukács ingeniously argued that extreme situations and typicality in characterization, the ability of a character to take on universal representative traits, are not opposed to one another. So the extreme is not opposed to the typical, but they're actually mutually constitutive and mutually reinforcing. And I'll just say as a sort of parenthesis, this question of type is really a crucial question for any realist theory, and therefore for any socialist or critical socialist realist theory that's of the sort that Lukács was mentioning. Basically, you have to be able to think about the way in which the character in a realist novel also translates certain kinds of typical social traits, And the problem for a Marxist theory of this was that it's not simply a matter of just extracting empirical qualities of a realistically represented character, but relating it in some way to representative characteristics in relation to the dialectic of history. That history is sort of tending towards some kind of unrealized meaning in the present, and it's important for the character to be typical, not simply as a sort of a photograph of the present, but as, in some sense, a kind of prefiguration of that historical future. And whether it's a matter of the positive hero in socialist realist theory of the party, or some sort of more sophisticated version of this Hegelian dialectic that you have in Lukács, it's a similar sort of problem. Now I'm going to come back to the question of how is the extreme situation related to this problem of typicality for Lukács. And he writes that basically he was able to see in some way in this moment in 1936 in the USSR where terror was really becoming a kind of intensified background of everyday life, that this was a privileged moment for writers to be able to discern the decisive historical forces that were bringing about this new human and therefore new literary types under socialism. And he writes, only through extreme intensification of typical situations can an author evoke from his characters the expression of the major contradictions of the time and exact the ultimate capacity for such expression latent in them. Now, I don't want to say that Lukács is simply doing a kind of literary theoretical justification of terror, but there's a way in which he is enfolding the idea of terror as this extreme historical situation as the possibility for recognizing the horizon of emergent human types in this historical moment. So to come back, these are just two examples, one from what we might consider the far left and the other from the far right, that this tension between the ideological and the anthropolitical frameworks and the desire of intellectuals to account for, control, and encompass the proliferation of ideological tensions through the explanatory means of anthropolitics leads a number of key 1930s European intellectuals to cast the problem of mimesis in new forms. In this emerging anthropolitical problematic of the 1930s, mimesis is no longer primarily conceived as an issue of artistic mirroring and representation of reality, although these things, may follow, but rather mimesis must first and foremost be considered an anthropological issue. That is, a mode of human comportment by which the material world is collectively appropriated and transformed. And then, derivatively, various sorts of literary theories may follow from this anthropological conception of mimesis. Mimesis is, for these thinkers, closely tied to questions of collective organization, behavior, and bodily practice, domains that are subject to both unconscious, emotional, and intentional ideological influence. And that's a crucial aspect, really, of 30s politics, is this new appreciation, for instance, of the emotional and symbolic organization of collectives, of crowds, what Benjamin would talk about, the aestheticization of politics. It's the way in which the aesthetic image helps to organize these modes of collective experience. So the background anthropologies that various thinkers deployed to understand these collective dispositions, these collective modes of behavior, had a crucial effect on their understanding about how the forms of art and literature were implicated in the field of ideology. In turn, their ideological commitments constrained to a greater or lesser degree their ability to affirm anthropolitical positions that might blur over their clear ideological positions. And I'll give you an example of this. Something that I was really, when I was thinking about this material, which is quite different than, the Anglo-American material that I often look at in my sort of English department role. I was looking at poets of the right and left, British poets in relation to the Spanish Civil War. And in particular, the people around W.H. Auden on the one hand, and the poet Roy Campbell, who was a friend of Wyndham Lewis, on the other hand, in their responses to the Spanish Civil War, one being sort of more or less Republican and even communist leaning, and the other being a fascist, a sympathizer with Franco's fascism. Now, it starts with basically kind of fairly clear ideological issues like the relationship of to fascism, the question of Catholicism in the Spanish Civil War, but their poetry very quickly begins to raise issues about homosexuality, about abortion, and this gets tied to questions of the fertility of the Spanish harvest on the Republican and the fascist sides. And I was trying to make sense of how this was really linked. And what I can see is that there's a certain kind of very quick slide from these ideological questions of, let's say, fascism and Catholicism over into what we would think of as properly biopolitical issues. Issues of reproduction, issues of gender construction, issues of life and death, issues of the, in the strange way, in the poetry, questions of the fertility of the soil and how it's related to reproductive politics under Catholicism or under, a kind of a Republican order. So this is really an attempt to try to think about those complex intersections of ideological politics and these other sorts of politics where you have poets of both sides talking about abortion or about homosexuality or other things that seem to be not very clearly mappable onto the ideological spectrum. Okay, so back to really my more French and German examples, but it's something where there was an application really to this other sphere of 1930s literature that I look at. In particular, I'm interested in the role that the Surrealist movement played in the development of this anthropolitical tendency. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Surrealists attempted to formulate from what was basically a kind of Marxist and Freudian position, what we might consider a general theory of experience within post-war urban modernity, and one that exceeded the anthropological framework of both second international social democratic Marxism or third international communist Marxism. So there's a much more capacious theory of urban experience and the experience of the unconscious and eroticism and so forth that the Surrealists attempt to develop. So in the writings of the 1920s and 30s, André Breton projected an artistically oriented group practice that would overcome the capitalist division of labor and radically displace the category of work as labor and also works as products of artistic labor in favor of a kind of generalized play, friendship, eroticism, intoxication, research, and eventually also political action. And you see these sorts of categories in Surrealist work. The somewhat parodically named Bureau of Research, where they would actually do surveys and have discussions of, well, what do you like to do, what are the sort of perversions that you have, what do you like to do in bed, and to document these sorts of researches. In his book, The Communicating Vessels from 1932, which is about the relationship, communicating vessels between dream and everyday life, it's a work that anticipates later critiques of everyday life, to use the terminology of Henri Lefebvre and of the Situationist. Breton would write, quote, that surrealism should not be considered existent except in the a priori non-specialization of its effort. So it's not painting, it's not even poetry in a very broad conception, it's a kind of non-specialized and not even simply artistic activity, but some kind of intervention into the very structure of human being and of life that is no longer divided along the lines of the division of labor. This non-specialized stance had the virtue of challenging, in the name of an integral human being, a rationalized division of labor that concealed the structural relations between the individual and the collective, subjective interiority and the outer world, the aesthetic and the political, and the spatially divided objects in urban space. This is the claim of Breton. While the delirious interpretations offered by the Surrealists usually aimed at a kind of lyrical, artistic effect, their derangement of given categories also, I would claim, holds broader epistemic implications. By instating at the heart of their aesthetic political project a programmatic and permanent revolt the surrealists allowed questions of anthropolitical function of existing social categories, classifications, and divisions to come to the fore of the surrealist program. These questions would then be taken up in earnest, especially by their critical successors, so people that would no longer be considered surrealist or that maybe were expelled by Breton from the surrealist movement. That would include a group of writers around Georges Bataille, including Roger Caillois, Michel Héris, Pierre Klosowski, and in exile from Nazism, Walter Benjamin. Now, two other key philosophical theoretical tributaries of surrealism that contribute to the anthropolitics of the 1930s in the work include the works of the influential philosopher of science, Gaston Bachelard, and also the don of French psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan, who was associated with the Minotaur sort of offshoots of the surrealist movement in the 1930s, and formulated his dissertation on paranoia in close dialogue with the so-called paranoid critical method of perception that Salvador Dali was articulating at the time. Bachelard, who introduced the notion of the epistemological break, the break into the non-Newtonian and non-Aristotelian, and introduced this into French philosophical discourse. If you've read Althusser, you know that that's also a notion that has really carried forward into the present. He originally saw his project of challenging scientific conceptual conventions as akin to the work of surrealism. Thus, in the first issue, the 1936 issue of the journal Inquisition, which was entitled The Organ of the Group for the Study of Human Phenomenology, edited by Louis Aragon, Roger Caillois, Jules-Marcel Moneret, and Tristan Tzara. So that also gives you a sense of the kind of coalition of surrealists, ex-surrealists, with other figures who were exactly fully aligned with surrealism. Bachelard in this issue published an essay that was entitled Surrationalism. So you can hear the echo of surrealism, surrationalism. There he presents views which, in their call for a radical reconfiguration of experience and of the object world, were very much caught up in the current debates around mimesis that had been spearheaded by Roger Caillois' essays, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But in this issue of the journal Inquisitions, Bachelard writes, "Human reason must be restored to its function of turbulent aggression. One contributes in this way to the founding of a surrationalism, which will multiply the occasions for thought. When this surrationalism will have established its doctrine, it can be allied with surrealism. Both sensibility and reason will then mutually be restored to their fluidity. The physical world will be experienced in new ways. It will be understood differently and felt differently. Two kinds of spiritual tasks may be anticipated. Reason will subdivide upon the experiential obstacle by an external dialectic. The interference of these two dialectics will determine, finally, the sur-empiricisms of a strange mobility, of a strange new force." Now, what exactly he means by this is not entirely clear, but you get the echoes of surrealism, that there's a kind of space of thought in relation to the object world, in relation to the possibility of scientific knowledge of the physical world that exceeds the bounds of a traditional rationalism, and that thought actually has to actively seek out and in some way aggress against the given conceptual frameworks. And Bachelard projects a kind of radicality in which he actually says that thought needs to project itself to the edge of a kind of utmost danger for the perceiving subject. And he writes, if in any experience one does not risk one's reason, that experience is not worthwhile attempting. So he's saying basically, scientific knowledge needs to take the risk of delirium if it's actually going to achieve this excess, which will lead to a kind of new knowledge, a new empirical knowledge, and a surrationalism, an exceeding of the bounds of a traditional rationalism. Now, as I mentioned in the 1930s, Jacques Lacan, the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, was closely aligned with Salvador Dali and moved in surrealist intellectual circles. I haven't seen them, but actually it said that he published various surrealist poems as well in his youth. In any case, he definitely wrote critical articles related to the psychoanalytic basis of surrealist theory. Dali influenced Lacan's dissertation on paranoia, while Lacan provided theoretical weight to Dali's so-called paranoia critical method of seeing multiple erotically provocative images interlarded in common objects. Moreover, Lacan was directly influenced by Roger Caillois' theory of anthropological mimetism. This is based on a very strange, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, but a strange sort of taking over of the question of mimetic behavior in insects. So, insects that imitate leaves or thorns or other sorts of things, taking it over and basically projecting it into the kind of human realm as a sort of model for social analysis. Lacan also was influenced by this work of Caillois. He mentions it in probably his most famous work on the mirror stage, and this essay on this theory of the mirror stage was actually first presented in Marienbad in 1936. So it really dates from this kind of 30s context. The 1949 version of the mirror stage essay, which is really the best known, which was published in the Écrit, refers substantially to Caillois' essays on mimicry, which were, as I mentioned, written in the 1930s, and as late as his 1964 lectures that were published as the 4 Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis. Lacan returned to these essays in his discussion of the gaze, which has been extremely influential in feminist theory and film theory, and really looked at this role of its constitution in the human subject. So my argument is basically that this, in some ways, is a legacy of the 1930s anthropolitics that Lacan was really engaged with via the surrealist context and this sort of renegade surrealist context that he was working in. Now, like Lacan, the acquaintance of Walter Benjamin with the surrealist and the renegade circles around Georges Bataille was intensive and direct. Louis Aragon's Paris Peasant was, as the early materials for the Arcades project, the Passagenwork show, a crucial influence on Benjamin's adoption of the Paris Arcade as a focus of his work. I mean, he basically says that he wrote something that he called a sort of dialectical fantasy, and it's really directly based on what Louis Aragon was doing in the Paris Peasant. Benjamin also had contact with Georges Bataille and Pierre Closovsky, who was the French translator of Benjamin's best-known essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Its Technical Reproducibility. Roger Caillois was also significant for Benjamin, who reviewed Caillois under a pseudonym because he was doing a negative review and he was actually kind of afraid of Roger Caillois. He was also influenced by, as well as critical of, Caillois' writings on myth, festival, and communal adhesion. The consistent thread that runs through Benjamin's relations to these surrealist and sort of ex-surrealist intellectuals was their contribution to a broad intellectual tendency that Benjamin would explicitly call anthropological materialism, which he saw as the foundation of a left-wing revision of the ideological politics along anthropolitical lines. So he introduces this term of anthropological materialism first in his surrealism essay. And then he picks it up again in various notes in the Arcades project. In both cases, it represented for him a sort of alternative tradition of materialism that was based in physiology, embodied thought, and embodied experience. And he saw it really as, at a minimum, running from the 18th century to the present. Anthropological materialism coalesces in Benjamin's work around 2 key aspects. One which is a philosophical aspect, and the other which is a kind of pedagogical, political one. In both instances, the guiding notion is that there's a reciprocity between bodily experience and modes of thought. So This notion is only explicitly formulated a few times in Benjamin's work, but it implicitly supports a lot of his thinking about the nature of subjectivity in metropolitan life, which is really the key concern in Benjamin's work of the late 20s throughout the 1930s. He sought to articulate in a series of critical images things like physiognomic perception, the one-way street, the arcade, the flaneur, the dreaming collective. These are different kinds of critical motifs in Benjamin's work. He sought to think of ways in which corporeal dispositions, bodily dispositions, could be directly translated into states of consciousness and vice versa. So by being involved in some way bodily in a collective organization that might involve buildings, materials like glass and iron, modes of transport, speeds of walking, commodities, social practices like prostitution or strolling or gambling, that these in some sense implied a kind of non-psychological mode of thought, that there was a kind of intentionality that was embedded in these embodied situations, and that we can think of these in a rigorous sense as being aspects of one and the same thing, the bodily and the, I don't even want to call it psychic, but let's call it sort of spiritual. So from this perspective of anthropological materialism, these modes of thought follow from the embodied situation of peoples and things in the metropolis and provide ways of conceiving of collectively embodied experience. So in short, he tries to incorporate, in the sense of giving body, to ideological conflicts and to various sorts of modes of thought in collectively embodied images, material images. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Benjamin later, but I'm going to skip over a couple of things in the interest of time because I did promise to keep this on the shorter side rather than the longer side, and I realized that although if I just read my paper and never made any parenthetical comments, it would be shorter. I've actually talked on a little longer about some of these motifs. So let me go on to a kind of amplification or modulation that Benjamin makes of this notion of anthropological materialism. It's a note that he actually gives. It's a specific negative form of anthropological materialism that he talks about in relation to the 1930s context, and particularly in relation to various sorts of literary and, let's call them, paraliterary ideologies related to fascism or proto-fascism in various sorts of forms. And he calls this negative anthropological materialism anthropological nihilism, or sometimes in a yet more specific context, which is related to the physiological disenchantment of writers such as Gottfried Benn, Carl Gustav Jung, and Louis Ferdinand Céline. He also speaks of a medical nihilism, so an anthropological nihilism or a medical nihilism. And these terms designate for Benjamin the failure of writers and intellectuals to come to terms with the negative moment in new subjectivities of the 1930s and the attempt to reorient them through destructively regressive myths or racialized antagonisms. They point to the disappearance of a horizon of collectively shared meaning within which the individual's isolation, fragmentation, and dispossession could be assuaged or even comprehended. So Benjamin, let me explain this medical nihilism, and he's really looking at the fact that Gottfried Benn and Céline and Jung all have this medical training, and actually we could point to that also in the Surrealists. Breton and Aragon actually first meet in a war hospital where they're basically medical orderlies. Benjamin uses this term medical nihilism to characterize a form of anthropological nihilism based on the dispossession of the individual body as a site of experience. So in an entry in the Passagen work in the Arcades project that's critical of Carl Gustav Jung's psychology, Benjamin wrote that, quote, "This nihilism emerged from the shock that the interior of the body imparts to its surroundings." And he has in mind here also the early work of Gottfried Benn, where there's a series of short poems that are written from the morgue. And they're various sorts of little little stories that are encapsulated in the corpses of the, that are kind of appearing in the morgue. So I think that Benjamin has this kind of poetry and this kind of expressionist poetry of Ben in mind as well. The development of medical nihilism was for Benjamin intimately linked to the widespread corporeal and psychic destruction in World War I, a site of intensive exposure to the inside of bodies to the outer world, as the horrifying spectacles of bodies thrown open, mutilated, or decomposed was carried forward into the streets of post-war Europe in the daily sight of war-damaged and shell-shocked veterans returning from trench fightings to the political disturbances of the home front. And I would say here, Wyndham Lewis would be another point of reference. Lewis very explicitly argues for a kind of valorizing of hardened outer shell, a sort of exteriority to this fearful, traumatic site of the interiors. And he carries out a kind of polemic against both female modernists like Gertrude Stein and also against people like Joyce that he conceived of as, in some ways, in an unsavory way, sort of exploring the interiority. And Lewis really wants to sort of reassert the integrity of the outer body. And I think that Benjamin's idea about medical nihilism gives us a kind of context for understanding that insistence on the armored exterior. That, I mean, Lewis basically says it would be better to, I prefer insects because of this kind of hard exoskeleton to the sort of soft tissue inside. And I think that this is really, closely related. Okay, I'm going to switch back now to the surrealist context. I said that I wanted to talk a little bit about the mimicry essays of Roger Caillois. So it's actually a useful segue to go from the insect of Wyndham Lewis to the praying mantis of Roger Caillois. So in 1934 and 1935, there was a two-part essay by the writer Roger Caillois, who had formerly been associated with surrealism and now had joined the group around Georges Bataille and was appearing in the cultural journal Minotaur. So the first part of the essay, which was entitled La Menthe religieuse, the praying mantis, explored the mythic and psychological significance of an insect that had obsessed the surrealists, both for its uncanny appearance and also for its copulatory practices, in which the female decapitates and devours the male after fertilization. So this seemed like the kind of ultimate of kinky sex for the surrealist, and it's also something that fascinated this Bataille group. Caillois surveys an impressive amount of ethnographic data to demonstrate a certain universality in the fascination that has been exerted by this particular insect. He goes on to speculate about the general significance of such mythically charged images, or what he calls ideograms, that there are these kind of psychic cultural ideograms. And also, he speculates on the source of their emotional power. Initially, he concludes that they demonstrate the existence of a set of, quote, phantasms responding to the behavior of other living species. So he sees this as a kind of interspecies communication through the emotions. But in the course of the essay, he heightens this claim to suggest a continuity that leads from the behavior of the insect to the activities of human consciousness, and that this chain implies a biomimetic constant of human imagination that's evident in both myth and in madness, the kind of obsession that myth and madness have with certain of these kinds of, we wouldn't necessarily, we might call them archetypes. He calls them these sorts of obsessive ideograms. Caillois also explored a peculiarity of the mantis, which is closely linked to the theme of the essay's second part, which is entitled Mimetism and Legendary Psychothenia, which appeared in Minotaur in 1935. And that's the other strange fact about the mantis, that is its ability to operate automatically even after decapitation. So this is a quote from Caillois' essay. It can walk, regain its balance. This is without a head. It can walk, regain its balance, move one of its threatened limbs autonomously, assume the spectral position, mate, lay eggs, and quite astoundingly, fall down in a false corpse-like immobility when confronted by danger. When dead, the mantis can simulate death. So as a defensive response, it can play dead already being dead. And this was, sort of a very uncanny fact that fascinated the Calois and the surrealists. So too the rigidity that engulfs the neurasthenic and the stiffness with which he or she performs ritualized movements are akin to the automatism of the decapitated mantis, according to Calois. This automatistic rigidity, which is a regression from individualized life, forms the pivot of Calois' exploration of animal mimicry. So if he starts really with the projection of the biological into the psychic and the human, he sort of turns this around in a kind of very interesting reversal of perspective. Calois rejects the traditional biological explanations of mimicry, which interpret it as a defense from predators and hence as an evolutionary adaptation. Rather, he suggests, mimicry is a sort of disturbance in the relation of the body to its surrounding space. So let's think of, a mimetic insect, something that's imitating a leaf, or imitating a thorn, or imitating a flower, or a bird form, or eyes, or these various forms of mimicry. He sees it as a disruption of the relationship of figure to ground, of the contours of the body's relationship to space. Mimicry, he suggests, is a sort of biological expression of what happens in human beings in schizophrenia, a loss of boundaries between self and others, a disfiguration of the individual, a depersonalizing assimilation to the surroundings. It represents, quote, a generalization of space at the expense of the individual, in which the individual becomes like the surrounding space and thus loses its distinctive individual features. And I'll just say, actually, it's something that if you read a later text, and this is from the 1940s, but Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment, there are these interesting passages that are about frightened animals. And the theory of mimesis in Dialectic of Enlightenment is, again, I think derived from Calois' idea of a disturbance in space, of a generalization of space, and a loss of individualization against the background of, the loss of figural integrity against the ground of space. So this is a work that really kind of goes on influencing various thinkers. You don't necessarily think of Lacan and Adorno in the same breath, but there is a sort of convergence point back in the mid-1930s in some of their thinking. So Calois goes on to propose an explanation for this disturbance of space, which suggests that the mimetism has a special affinity for modernity in human society. So we've gone from the insect to a certain kind of claim about contemporary modernity. He notes the complexity of human spatial perception, which depends on aligning the trajectory of the body's action with the mental representations of space. When the object exerts an excessive force of fascination, as in the case, for instance, of the praying mantis on human beings, or else that the experience is too intense or complex to be properly represented, it can lead to a kind of general destructuration and a loss of the body's bearings in space. Calois relates the displacement of the subject, it's being cut loose to assimilate itself in a system of points without center, to the proliferation of non-Euclidean spaces in modern science and technology, and by extension, really, the emergence of technologically rather than, let's say, human phenomenologically measured spaces also in the urban environment, in the built environment, in the industrial environment. And he says, Calois concludes, the feeling of personality cannot fail under these conditions to be seriously undermined. Now I'd like to conclude by a return to Walter Benjamin, and this is a late text that probably is influenced by Calois, and it lucidly brings out the anthropolitical implications of Calois' mimetic theory. This is in a letter to Gershom Scholem, dated the 12th of June 1938, in which Benjamin offers the following reflections on Franz Kafka. He notes Kafka's extreme, quote, physical perplexity in the ordinary world. You get a sense of, Kafka kind of wandering around a little lost or something. And Benjamin goes on to say that it doesn't suffice to see Kafka's mystical traditional impulses as being in tension with the modern world represented by metropolitan life, as well as by the most up-to-date physics and technology. Benjamin says what is actually, I have that here, what is actually, and in a very literal sense, wildly incredible in Kafka is that this most recent world of experience was conveyed to him precisely by this mystical experience. So this experience of ultra-modernity is actually conveyed to Kafka via this mystical tradition. This, of course, could not have happened without devastating processes within this tradition. The long and short of it is that apparently an appeal had to be made to the forces of this tradition if an individual by the name of Franz Kafka was to be confronted with that reality of ours which realizes itself theoretically, for example, in modern physics, and practically in the technology of modern warfare. So in other words, he's basically saying Kafka needed some kind of translation space or some kind of metaphorics to be able to understand this non-intuitable experience that is the experience of contemporary modernity. Benjamin goes on to say, what I mean to say is that this reality can virtually no longer be experienced by an individual, and that Kafka's world, frequently of such playfulness and interlaced with angels, is the exact complement of his era, which is preparing to do away with the inhabitants of this planet on a considerable scale. Kafka lives in a complementary world, and here he means complementary in the sense of physics, a kind of complementarity and in some sense a kind of a parallel universe in some way. So in Benjamin's view, Kafka chose to retreat into the rigor of tradition, which necessitated a kind of mimetic regression from the real world. But in this way, he preserved a measure of personal response to the essentially impersonal and depersonalizing conditions that constituted the reality of the 1930s, or the 1920s in Kafka's case, 1930s in Benjamin's writing. In this paradoxical mimesis of the modern world, through the figures of mystical tradition, Kafka prefigured the anthropolitical predicaments of the 1930s, yet still, in Benjamin's view, retained a narrow edge over those who would follow in the 1930s. And my concluding quote is this, again, from the letter to Sholem. If one says that Kafka perceived what was to come without perceiving what exists in the present, one should add that he perceived it essentially as an individual affected by it. His gestures of terror are given scope by the marvelous margin which the catastrophe will not grant us. Thank you.